mental illness, ableism, and racism. And so if any time you feel the need to disengage or step out for a few minutes, you are more than welcome to. Also, I'm aware that the term Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander represents a wide, diverse, and complex variety of groups and nationalities, and that we will inevitably have different experiences, and it's important to recognize that. The goal of this event, however, is to highlight some of the commonalities in our experiences and the struggles we face, and learn how we may be able to address them together. As Audre Lorde once said, "It is not our differences that divide us, but our inability to recognize, celebrate, and accept those differences." Lastly, I would like to clarify some terms. We often use the terms mental health and mental illness interchangeably, but I think it's important that we differentiate them. Mental health is similar to physical health and is something that everybody has. It's essentially just another word for mental well-being. And just like how we all, at some point in our lives, will struggle with our physical health, we will all likewise have struggles with our mental well-being throughout our lives. Mental illness, however, is an illness that affects the way people think, feel, behave, or interact with others. There are many different mental illnesses, and they each have different symptoms that impact people's lives in many different ways. As we commence with our discussion today, I just think it is important that we keep this distinction in mind. Thank you. So I would like to introduce each of our speakers today. First, we have Dr. James Campbell. He is a psychiatrist with 45 years of both public and private experience. Dr. Maki Obana, she is a licensed psychologist based in Chandler. Dr. Brandon Yu, he is a professor at ASU. And Ms. Tashi DeKoja, she is currently the lead presenter of the National Alliance on Mental Illnesses Ending the Silence program. Thank you. For our first question, Dr. Campbell and Dr. Obana, you both had experience as psychiatrists, like dealing with people with mental illness who are part of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. So what are some of the special challenges that you face with providing mental health services to those in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community?
Okay, let me start. Just to outline the challenges that we have, there are several, but I would like to highlight first the awareness and acceptance of mental health among the, by the way, when I say Asian community, I'll lump all three, okay? Just so I won't be forgetting the Pacific Islanders or the like. So I will just say Asian community. But anyway, the first is the mental health awareness and acceptance of mental health. I'll get back to that. Then the second is the cultural difference of how we perceive mental health and mental illness. And I want to say quickly, as you said, that there are 19 ethnic communities in Asia. So we will be generalizing, but if you are an exception, you are an exception, all right? So don't get offended when I make a generalization, because there is a vast difference, but there are also commonalities. The other issue that I have in my private practice is with language of Asian. I can only speak English. I'm from the Philippines, but I could not speak to the dialect, especially first generation in my office. I have to have an interpreter, and it's not possible all the time. And the language is both coming from them and from the provider. And the provider, that's lacking really. And then after that, you have the poverty of our community. We still have a higher poverty level than and the white community, regardless of they think that we are all, well-to-do Asian. That's like the model Asian community that you're talking about. And then there are also prejudice that is really present, and this hopefully we will have a good discussion on the stigma, because the stigma is marking and associating a person to be somebody less or disgraceful or less than they are either. And the common stigma is the illness is he's crooked, he's bad guy, bad genes, and real weak. All right, and then after that you have the social stigma and the stigma on the media. All of these are joined together to give our challenges in mental health in the Asian community. And then we don't have providers either. If you go to California and LA, then there are culturally specific providers, but not here in Arizona. Sorry to take too much time.
Dr. Bana, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. The language piece is definitely the big piece. I have been only Japanese speaking therapist in the Bali for such a long time. So the folks coming from Tucson or Payson or even farther, and then the Asian American, it's particularly for the first generation, don't access to car, can't drive, and then have to rely on somebody to drive to. I have practiced in Chandler, and that's a long drive. That is also discouraging to seek therapy, and also Asian American or /Asian tend to complain about more somatization issues. I can sleep, more medical complaining than mental health. So it is oftentimes difficult to engage what's really going on, and it has to take time to understand about depression and anxiety. It is okay. It is okay to feel this way. That's okay. That's scared. Because it's difficult for Asian American to express their emotion. Accepting about I am depressed, I have a depression is huge fear. So engagement of this conversation is particularly challenging to me.
May I add something on that? The Asian Americans express more of their mental symptoms by physical complaints. Bad stomach, headache, bloating stomach, cannot sleep. They don't say I'm hearing voices or I don't get along with people. They tend to make it personal. Just want to tell you that because some of the providers, especially not trained in the Asian culture, will look for the signs and symptoms and complaints that they know in the Western culture. But it's not there. They will not find. So then they'll say, oh, he's not sick. So just go to the primary care or consider that it's malingering. Okay, I'm sorry.
Ms. Dichosa, a lot of your work has focused on reaching out to people who are maybe struggling with mental illness and getting them to accept that it's okay. And a study by the National Institute of Mental Health concluded that AANHPIs are much more likely than other ethnic groups to seek out these mental health services. So, based on your personal experience, what do you think are some reasons why this is so? And how do you think this problem could be addressed?
First off, we have to tackle the first thing, which is breaking the stigma. And that's my main goal of being, as a Phoenix Asian American Lions Club, to really enforce that. And my first step is partnering up with National Alliance of Mental Illness, which is the Valley of the Sun, which is their Ending the Silence program, which is addressing the first step, is breaking the stigma. I was one of those kids who struggled with depression and panic attack, and one of the struggles is, I always say, because I moved here in America when I was 16. It's not a language that is encouraged. it's not even, like, depression is not really touched in my family, in my generation. So I always say, you have to name you have to name your demon first before you can tackle and solve the problem. Because if there's no name for it, then how would I tackle it? So I starting to learn how, oh, okay, this feelings that I'm feeling is depression. So I have to name that specific thing, because before I thought the way of thinking, it's like, well, in Asian community, it's like there's this thing called, I don't know if I should say this, but we're all adults. You get your shit together and just move on. There's no other way. So that's how we deal with stuff. It's like there's no addressing the first stage of what you're feeling is depression. What you're feeling is a panic attack. There's no name for it. There is a name, there is a name, but it's not known to when I was growing up. I'm 34, by the way. So that was like in early 90s of like feeling these emotions, but I didn't really know about it until I moved to America. That there is a name for it. That it is so to speak, normal. Because before, when you're going through it, I didn't know what I was feeling, and I didn't know how to tackle. So I spent all my 20s being depressed, and I have my, mechanism of trying to be busy, or I would fall back to feeling drowned in darkness and sinking. So my other way of mechanism was like, I gotta be busy. Because if I'm not busy, then I'm gonna go sink into darkness again. So it's important for me the ending the silence is really important to me, because it addresses those feelings. It's opening up the conversation that whatever that you're feeling, there's a name for it, and it's okay. Then the first step is to seeing a doctor and psychologist and addressing these issues and feelings. Because if we don't name it, then we're not gonna find a solution for it.
Yeah, those are some really good thoughts. Dr. Yu, a lot of your research has focused on the intersection between culture and mental illness. So how much of an influence do you believe that culture has on the expression of mental illness in the AANHPI community? And what are some specific ways that it influences mental illness?
Sure. And the short answer to that is that for me, I believe a lot, if not all of culture informs how mental health, mental disorder, and mental illness are conceptualized. But to sort of take a step back from that, I think from a theoretical research perspective and to much in terms of how clinicians translate what mental health and mental illness, there's sort of three broad perspectives. So one, in sort of an absolutist perspective that sort of articulates that, mental illnesses like depression, anxiety are sort of absolute, sort of across cultures. There are these things that exist sort of everywhere, sort of like medical illness. So mental illness, sort of adaptation from that. Like, what are the core sort of experience or expectations of depression, schizophrenia that looks sort of universal across culture? The other end of the sort of spectrum and how we think about sort of culture and mental health is a relativist perspective, where we can't start to talk about what depression is unless you understand the cultural context in which that sort of depression is informed, right? And then somewhere in the middle is sort of trying to borrow both in terms of looking at cultural generality as well as cultural specificity. And I tend to lean a little more towards a relativist perspective, because we do know that for many reasons. So here, let me start this off. So if you look at some of the common symptoms like depression and anxiety, that do vary considerably across culture, right? So some of the presenters here sort of talked about, like, depression oftentimes, rather than focusing on the sadness or sort of not being able to get up in bed, you tend to focus more on sort of physical complaints, right? Sort of not having a headache, my stomach hurts. Anxiety, social anxiety, for example, is also experienced very differently. For example, in the US, when you feel so socially anxious, you feel socially anxious because you feel like you're going to mess up. I'm going to embarrass myself in front of these other people. That's why I feel socially anxious. Where often a lot of the other sort of Asian countries, like particularly Japan, like there's a symptom called taijin kind of official, where the social anxiety sort of experience is not sort of focused on itself, but others. I'm going to embarrass my colleagues. I'm going to embarrass my parents. I'm going to embarrass. So it's how we think, feel, behave, how can that not translate to how sort of these manifestation of mental health is supposed to be experienced and cause distress? Even something as hardcore as schizophrenia oftentimes have varying cultural sort of symptomology, both presentation and manifestation, as well as later treatment. For example, Asian Americans, when we think about sort of schizophrenic symptoms, we think of sort of more the positive symptom, not in terms of the value, but in terms of like, I hear things, I feel things, I'm having these thoughts that feels very real to me. There's also symptomology of schizophrenia that are negative symptoms, which is like you experience the absence of something, like you don't move a lot, you don't talk a lot. And so we see sort of differences even in that in terms of Asians and Asian Americans that are less acculturated to the US culture present those symptoms consistent with that in contrast to those that grew up sort of in the US. Separate from that, there's a host, in how we sort of currently conceptualize, which is a little bit oxymoronic in terms of how DSM has sort of its symptoms and then a separate cultural balance syndrome, which is sort of unique to a particular culture. But yeah, everything in the DSM is also, for me, culturally balanced. But that point aside, culture balance syndromes are these things that are supposed to be very unique to a particular culture. Like, how I got into the field, actually. My mother had Hwabyeong, which translates to Korean anger disease. It's kind of like the Incredible Hulk of Korean Americans. And it's this sort of cluster of like depression, anxiety, insomnia, midlife crisis, among other things that can't be uniquely captured by the DSM classifications. And so we struggled, in part, the underutilization, the stigma is tied to this sort of lack of sort of cultural competency and cultural care resources that allowed clinicians to really understand that this is not just simply depression, chronic insomnia, or a sort of a medical condition, that there's something else here. And so there's another example of, again, how that sort of culture informs the experience of mental health and mental illnesses. So I don't want to keep going on. I'm a professor, so I can go on for the next hour on this. So
would anyone like to add to or respond to that? No? Okay, we can move on to the next question. So, culture is obviously something that influences the expression of mental illness, but another one is age. A study by the American Psychological Association has shown that second-generation Asian Americans are more likely to have emotional disorders than their parents. Why do you think that this may be the case, and what do you think that could be done to help address mental illness in AAPI youth?
May I take on that? All right. By the way, I am a clinician and I am practicing in Scottsdale. So whatever I say is not pertinent to my clinical practice. What I will be talking if I talk is just scenario. Okay, so just want to be clear because it's not for us to talk about who we see, whether they are in here or outside. Okay, at any rate, your question in reference to, could you read your question?
So it's, why do you think that youth?
Yeah, okay. Just imagine this. Well, mental illness for us Asians are really generational in complaints and in treatment. And that's why it's important for providers to be aware of this rather than treat you with just one medication and that will take care of everything that you are complaining. Just imagine a second generation 16-year-old lady. Because by the way, from 15 to 24, the highest rate of suicide is among the Asian girls or ladies. And then after that, at the age of 65, the highest rate of suicide is Asian women. So there you are. But at any rate, just imagine a second generation who is in free world, living at home, where this is the community, the parents are very secretive, they are tight, and they don't want you to talk about anything in terms of their problems because this is us. There is what they call courtesy stigma that if something is wrong with you, the rest of the family is wrong, so we better keep it. All right? And then that's one world. And then the other world of a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old is the world in the Western culture. The demands, the sexual activities, and all the pressure of your generation and the teachers in school. And here you are caught between, should I talk or should I just keep quiet to save my family? So tremendous pressure, so that those who cannot resolve that, like perhaps the third or fourth generation who are more assimilated, they are caught in between. So what do they resolve? Drugs, pills, alcohol. So all of these they are under tremendous pressure between the two cultures and their own self-assessment. So that's why this is true in terms of second generation young ladies, for that matter.
So, yeah.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
I think Dr. Kimball brings up a really great point, and the research do support that as well in terms of an acculturated family conflict. Family conflict is a result of acculturated gap, right? Basically, kids acculturate much faster than that of the parents, which creates a lot of tensions in terms of how parenting practice, among others, which leads to a variety of different psychological distress and adjustment. I wanted to add to that perspective in the sense of the literature that, first, when we look at, well, let me take a step back. That study that you were citing is by David Takuchi on the National Latino and Asian American Studies. It's sort of the first national study that was done on the mental health issues of Asian American and Latinx community for the very first time in history. So it's a huge deal. It was data collected back in 2002 and 2003. So I want to acknowledge them, that if it wasn't them, we wouldn't have any sense of prevalence rates of disorders or how these things are related to one another. Along with that, what their data found was consistent with that. Not only did younger kids as well as second generation have reports of more emotional distress and mental illness as compared to that of the parents, that research finding is consistent with what we find in larger patterns across not only mental health, physical health, education, among others, otherwise referred to as immigration paradigms. And so in short, what that articulates is that the longer you live in the US, the more maladjusted, fat, and issues that you can have, less academic motivations, academic achievements, among other things. So I think what that speaks to is this idea of one, idea of acculturating into the US being seen as the best model. I think it contests that. Another part of it is just acknowledging the differences in what that means for these kids in particular, right? So it may be that as they acculturate into the US, they may just be more likely to identify the symptoms of what mental illness or mental health is. That may be very different than that of their parents and their before, right? So when parents sees this as a medical issue, I can very soon say that's depression and social anxiety, right? And so whether they're more maladjusted or with these symptoms, maybe, long story is we don't know. Maybe because acculturation happens and resources and these conflicts aren't dealt with, right? And we need better resources and opportunities to have this conversation. Another may be that it may be overestimated or over-reporting because it's how we define those in the first place, and the more you acculturate, the more you're readily able to identify those things as depression, anxiety, and these other factors as well. The last point that I want to make about this is that we have to be mindful about the stereotypes of our community, not only in terms of being the Asian Americans being the model minorities that disguise this, but also there's a tighter parenting aspect of it, right? So our kids are having so much academic pressure, they're really maladjusted and have higher levels of suicide and ideation and other things. And I want to be I want to temper or provide I want to challenge that assumption about Asian American kids in particular, or youth, being more maladjusted and having high expectation. It is that they do experience acculturated stress and family conflict, among other things. But we also see amazing in the research resiliency in this aspect. so even with more research, we know that actually now Asian American youth between the ages of 15 to 24 having the highest suicide rate is not true. It's Native American, Alaskan Indians. Asian Americans are actually at a national rate less like Asian Americans actually think and commit suicide a lot
More than-
significantly less than the national rate actually. So not to say that suicide and the unique cultural stressors aren't a significant, and suicide in particular is not an important conversation to have in the Asian American community, but I also think that we need to be mindful about sort of the stereotypes that reinforce that we're this sort of kind of really academic oriented, socially deficit and mentally sort of maladjusted sort of group of individuals, right? Because again, as everyone sort of outlined before, there's great heterogeneity in how those are experienced as well.
I would just like to add that while we are talking about mental illness in Asia, I mean, it's really not catastrophic in terms of our overall picture. There are a lot of healthy Asian American kids, I mean, younger people out there than we think, but as we are talking about it here, we're talking about the 13 or 15% of the whole Asian community. So it's that's who we are talking.
I also want to add something about the clinical perspective. I have seen a lot of second generations in my clinic, and their kids have so much pressure from their parents to be doctor, lawyers. Anything else is not job. So you have to be either doctor or lawyer. But nowadays, we have a lot of interest. If you want to be artist, there's no such thing to exist. You have to be either doctor or lawyer. And so kids are really struggling about, you have to achieve your academic goal. And also, Asian American were taught, especially parents have their own value from their home country that elderly has to be respected. You can't talk back to parents. So kids have really discouraged to express what they want to be in the future, because that is disappointing to parents, and that is not allowed. And also, the difference between acculturation and immigrant who has still strong value with their home country, the way they raise is different. So oftentimes I hear that I was physically abused by my parents. But parents have, a common discipline. And physical discipline is common, a practice in their country. So, parents didn't mean it, but children feel really hard and get traumatized from that physical, punishment. And also, Asian not to tend to express their, emotion well. And, American parents say, I love you. But I never, my parents never told me I love you. So my parents don't love me. No one loves me. So their, self-esteem has really shaky. And they have, different perspective about expressing love.
I just want to add a different way to share my story. So if you go to my New York family, the girls are in medical, and then the guys are engineers and stuff like that. So me and my family, I'm the only girl and the youngest. So there's a lot of pressure of like being in a medical field. And I did went to health services management, but being in the beauty industry is close to my heart. So when I shifted and find the courage to switch field and to tell my mom, like, yeah, by the way, I'm gonna pursue being in the beauty industry, that's even a hard conversation. And my mom and I did not speak for a year, just switching field. The most terrifying word that you could ever have in the Asian culture is, you disappoint me. So even the courage of like trying to tell her about it, it's really hard, because you have a pressure of like, well, I'm supposed to be in the medical field. And the language in general is not really there. Like what you said, the emotion part of it, of just saying, I love you. I remember my boyfriend that made me move here in Arizona we've been going out for like 1 year, and he said, "Do you even love me?" I'm like, "Yeah, I do." And he's like, "But you never said I love you." And I'm like, because it's not something that I grew up with to begin with, so I'm not really vocal. But Asian community, we do say I love you. Well, you came home, I cooked dinner for you. You came home, I cleaned the house for you. So we say it in a different ways. We're just not very vocal about it, which I'm grateful for him, because now I know how to say I love you. You know, so it took it 5 years after that, but I got there.
A lot of your work focuses on like reaching out to kids who may have similar experiences and relate to a lot of these problems that we discussed. So what do you think are some ways of addressing these problems in the youth, especially?
How is that?
Sorry.
Come again?
Oh, so like what do you think are some ways that we can address these problems that we just discussed?
I think NAMI's program of Ending the Silent is such a powerful program that I can't wait to, like, I have a goal in my head that I want to reach every school in Arizona, because that opens up the conversation. Is really important, because right now we have like, so, you know, a lot of lists, but I really want to push that to aim more and more school to have that open conversation about it. I think that program would make a lot of difference in affecting our youth and our children. People think that if we talk about suicide, oh, that's gonna put thoughts in their head they're gonna commit suicide. No, I was one of those kids that, you know, attempted suicide twice. And it's because I didn't have a person to talk to. Because first of all, I'm trying to figure out my feelings, what are they? And having to, you get stuck in your head and you don't have anybody to talk to. And that's where the negative mechanism starts of like suppressing your feelings. So, and I was a kid who was quiet and go to church and stuff, and then it flipped, just the personality, and I get agitated and I deflect because I wasn't addressing those root problems. So I think that ending the silence, having that open conversation and reaching out to kids, like, how many kids do you think that suppress their feelings? You know, it opens that door of communication, and we're gonna tackle, and where my dream is to, in my head, it's like, in this way I can help, you know, like the statistics in suicide. Like, that's the bigger version in my head that I can affect that way.
To address this, really there is no one way of addressing how you can change. This is one way, of course, but we have to start early, from school, to get the counselors to know this particular Asian culture on what is going on with the kids. You start early. You can even start on the first generation who just arrived here, because somebody has to talk to them, to tell them, you know, what's happening with them. From there, from high school, you have to educate again the young Asians that it's okay to talk, because the privacy is a main issue with us Asians, that you don't share it, because again, it involves the whole shame of the whole group. And then from there, when you are in college, get to know the people who are in educating us culturally, like Dr. Yu and Dr. Obana here, and so that they will have the experience, because it is a generational shift. And then eventually, to address the Asian problem, we have to get culturally acclimated therapists. You know, you have to get that, and then hopefully we can all influence the politicians to pass laws that will benefit the health insurance and all of those things. So it's a rather a complicated answer to your question, but that's how the trend should be.
And I think one of other method or way is to educate parent. Oftentimes I invite a parent to this session, and then explain about what's going on, then parents go, oh, I didn't know my daughter or son has such an emotional distress. Okay, I don't want my kid to die or suicide. Instead, it's going to different way. If that makes avoiding to losing my son or daughter, I should do that to realize how much is pressure and how much is emotional distress to their kids. And I have to keep in my mind, I am a first generation of an immigrant, so up to this point, I feel like I have to really survive. I have to do I have to succeed to survive this country. I left my country, therefore I have to do better than that I was in Japan. So that mentality is always, I have to keep going, I have to do, double, that's, 3 times more than Americans. That mentality, I have to keep in my mind that I shouldn't, push to my children.
I like when you said we have to educate our parents first. Part of the NAMI Valley Descents Ending the Silence program is that we go and present to the staff first, and then we present to the parents before we present to the children, so that the adults know what we're doing and what impact we want for this program. We got invited into one of the charter schools where last year a student committed suicide. So we came back in July to present with the staff, and then we have a meeting to meet to the parents, and then we're gonna schedule to meet with the children and have our speaking.
Let me just add something to that, especially first generation, and we have refugees here from Asia, and I am a consultant to the refugees. There is no way at times that I can reach them, and at times they don't believe that it is a mental illness, it's a punishment from some God, that it takes a shaman. So once you realize that what we did is Skype. Skype is a good feature now for those who needs therapist or shaman from here to communicate with people here. It is really, that's social media is into the treatment too, so that it is, I have used and recommended social Skype to first generations or older parents who cannot talk or refuse to address their problems here, but they are willing to talk to someone in their country. So that's really, I just wish to share that because that's coming.
So we were talking about this earlier, and you just mentioned how some of the people seeking treatment are refugees, and that doesn't fit with the stereotype we have, the model minority. So Dr. Yu, could you talk about more about how this myth about the model minority factors in?
Sure. So this common stereotype around Asian Americans being the model minority is the idea that Asian Americans are really hardworking and believe in the American dream. But if you sort of look at the history of this stereotype, and have you ever thought about this? Why is it that Asian Americans are the model minority and not African Americans or Latinx or any other groups? Why Asian Americans, right? And also, second, is it Asian Americans who go around saying that they're the model minorities, we're the badasses who study the most, or is it other groups, right?
Depends on the school.
Right, yeah, yeah. So, right, because I think our sort of individual experience as Asian Americans were very similar in terms of the expectations, burden, and pressure, right? Even my own research in this area came because growing up in Orlando, Florida, predominantly white space, I sort of kind of grew up with being filled with very few Asians. I was supposed to be really good at math and science, and literally teachers would pass me in not helping me because they thought I knew it, or students sat next to me and got C's and D's because they thought I would know. So if you sort of look at the history of that, it's really interesting because that sort of specific narrative around the comparative success of Asian Americans, more so than Black, Latinx, or any other groups, that they work harder to believe in the American dream, is a narrative that came out actually shortly after the Civil War. After blacks were freed, Chinese Americans from the West Coast were brought in to the southern plantations, and they were pitted, the white sort of masters pitted Chinese coolies against sort of the freed blacks against one another to say that these are the cheaper sources of labor that work really, really hard, and so you're not needed. And so it was sort of to sort of blame African Americans and pit them indirectly against one another to obviously maintain sort of the benefits of whites. And so we see that narrative play out there for the very first time, and then we see it play out again shortly after the Civil Rights Movement. William Peterson, white sociologist, really is the one that coined the term modern minority, to sort of highlight basically the conservative voice in response to the civil rights, where black, brown, and yellow were fighting for equal rights and structural sort of equal opportunities. The conservative sort of response to that in Congress and sort of in the public was, stop complaining. Like, look at the Asian Americans and how hard they sort of work. You need to get over slavery that happened so many years ago. We still have the same language now, right? And the civil rights was so, long ago. So there's a sort of idea that racism has gone away, and Asian Americans have been used to sort of pit other communities against one another to sort of say that racism is gone, and we know that's simply not true. So for me, how I think about Asian Americans understanding the modern minority myth is how they internalize racism, how they sort of start to believe in this sort of false narrative that comparing the success of Asian Americans is driven by hard work and individual belief and unrestricted mobility in the US. So if you sort of think about it that way, and you think about internalized racism, then it kind of makes sense why Asian Americans who internalize the modern minority myth would have higher levels of psychological distress. Several studies recently came out finding that Asian Americans who internalize the modern minority myth also are less likely to get help because they have this assumption that they're supposed to do really, really well. And particularly it's for those that are underperforming academically, economically, where the modern minority myth is super dangerous for Asian Americans. My research has now grown to sort of highlight how even for whites who endorse the modern minority stereotype, so whites who believe that Asian Americans work really hard and believe in the American dream, it's just like you would think that they would be more interculturally confident because they favor Asian Americans or whatever else, but we find the exact opposite. We find that whites who endorse the modern minority stereotypes are more likely to be uncomfortable interacting with Asian Americans as well as other people of color, and are more likely to have racist attitudes and beliefs and behaviors toward these other groups. Again, function of internalized racism that sort of maintains. So I think my point, the reason why I want to give you that broader perspective is that for us as Asian Americans who keep getting these messages of like we're supposed to be better and not ever challenging that sort of thesis, we personalize it. We personalize the racism as this is our fault, right? Is because of the way that we look or what we can't do. But if you understand the actual history, if you understand the sort of the critical sort of narrative about the exploitation of not only Asian Americans but other communities of color and benefit of whiteness and white power and privilege in the context of racism, and then further to sort of complicate that in terms of intersectionality with gender, class, and sexuality and other sort of dimensions that we sort of try to emphasize over and over again before we speak, then you sort of kind of dispel the myth. You are less likely to internalize that when you become more critically conscious around that. And it's when we don't do that as a community, as individuals, we start to literally see these negative implications, not only in terms of our psychological or mental health, but broader within our communities, across communities. How do we understand, I don't want to go off about Black Lives Matter, and the Syrian refugees, undocumented that's happening right on our border. The modern minority myth matters in that sense because we have been pitted against one another when those issues are our issues because of our racialized trajectories that maintains certain groups' benefits. And I'll stop right there.
Very interesting. Would anyone like to add to that?
Let me just say that your research and your discussion is quite a good learning experience as we reach out to the rest of our community. Meanwhile, though, for those who are suffering now, for us clinicians, that that parent that wants you to be an engineer or a nurse or a doctor is here, and the pressure is real. So until we get really educated educated or assimilated and learn from research, because that's one of the weakness that we have. We don't really have a complete research on the culture and on our treatment. Once we do that, that would be wonderful. So this is where we are at this time. Sharing experience. There are 7 kids in our family. 6 accepted the idea that they will be nurses, physicians, and lawyers without any conflict, except one. So you can see the pressure, and it's really acceptance. It's not even dictated who this should, what this should be. When I was young, they say, hey, this it's nice, you know. I'm happy that way. But at any rate, that's just what I share, that the research should come so that then our adjustment for the future will be much better.
I mean, one added to that is also, if you think about sort of the clinical or counseling implications in terms of culturally competent resources, that's one of the things that happen at sort of at the community and the national level, right? Is that we often talk about how we need to have these conversations and mental health services that are more culturally informed, competent, but yet that sort of seems to always take secondary to the idea that Asian Americans are always sort of more successful, and which then limits looking at the diversity of Asian Americans when we look at the census tract and how we sort of fund our resources to various communities, how local agencies and community health clinics even think about their local community in terms of how they serve Asian Americans, because maybe directly and indirectly there's a bias of them again being more minorities, right? So what does it mean to deconstruct those narratives? And again, as you point out, Dr. Campbell, like, how does it sort of impact the clinical work?
Got an answer for you later. No, I understand what he's saying. I have an answer for him later.
Okay. We get to the question.
Yeah, when we get to the question.
So, Dr. Amana, what are some specific ways that one's race or ethnicity could impact the quality of treatment that they would receive if they seek out that treatment?
Yes. For understanding of culture and ethnic background is very important. And Asian American / Pacific Islander has a very variety of different cultures and different value styles, and so for the provider to understand those values are very important, as well as speaking of their on their own language is also very important, because that affects and influence a lot of ways. Mental health is very sensitive nuances to tell about what you experience and feeling, and feel may not be a good question to ask. So I tend to ask how's your reaction instead of how do you feel. That's very important for Asian American, because when somebody was asked for feeling, immediately said, I never thought about it feeling, I don't know. That's the answer. So then it's stuck. But so when things and this one doesn't happen, how is your reaction? Then they talk a lot of reactions, not feeling based, but eventually going to the feeling. So it considered to the cultural value is very important to have good quality of treatment.
So I've researched, this is back in 2018, they said most like 18% most likely that a white person will be diagnosed with depression, but our statistics with the Asian community is only 13%, and you, as Asian American, I'm gonna generalize that, Asian people, you'll see them more in the emergency room or the outpatient, because we wait till the last minute, because we suppress, because we, going back to cultural of like, you don't want to put shame in your family, you don't want to be that disappointment, so we suppress and stuff like that. So I feel like your technique and that the physicians have to find ways and really get to know our culture, how we function, how we grow up, so that, because when you ask the question of like, how are you feeling, I'm already shutting down, because we're talking about a feeling that, for one, I've never paid attention to my feelings because it's not exercise to really feel anything. You are programmed to continuously be better. You obey, you don't disagree. So understanding the cultural background, specifically in the Asian community, we will have better statistics, I guess, because in the statistics in the Asian community is not accurate, in which breaking the stigma is all about, is having that first initial step, which is having that communication and educating our parents. And my goal, not just as, you know, as a philanthropist and stuff like that, I have my personal goals to break the chain in my own family, that I want to be that first person to open that conversation, because I always say, my child would not have the same story as I am, because my father wasn't strong enough to be here and never made it 30, and unfortunately, he committed suicide. So when I was having those thoughts of like my failed attempts, I said there has to be a greater calling for this one. And that created my goal of like, I'm gonna break the stigma within my family, that I'm gonna speak up with it. And then it opens up my bigger picture of like, it's not, I'm pretty sure it's not just me. So I'm gonna make a bigger dream of like, I'm gonna look for organization which Virtue and NAMI Valid Descendant and Descendants program. So it's really tackling that first conversation, and even like physicians of like struggling. I heard somebody who said, yeah, they were here like 2 times and had a therapy 2 times, but never came back. It's within the conversation. It's finding the right words to lead as a physician and as your background as a professional, of really when you get to know someone's culture, and then you'll understand how to approach. Because sometimes for me it's like, well, I want to get to know you too, you know, because that's my way of trusting you, and then I can more open up. Does that make sense?
Thank you for sharing your personal history. That shows where you are, from where you are to your improvement at this time. Okay. At any rate, let me share with you just quickly on the clinical side, on the providers. I want to tell you that several things that Asian therapists Western therapists will expect on an Asian patient, especially first generation, is eye-to-eye contact. Oh boy, that's the last thing that you need to do. They will not look at you, and they will think that this is not serious business because they don't look at me in the eyes. Or extend your hands for shaking hands. You would rather, or do differently, not that. But the worst part in the clinical side are those who are not aware that we Asians don't metabolize our medicine as quickly as the white community. My practice is to give half of the required doses to Asians rather than the full dose that is studied for the American or for the white community. Because once I give them, and I learned this by mistake, I give them the full dose, they will be sleepy, they will not come back to you, he's not the right doctor. So, you know, those are some of the clinical things that are also needed for the professionals to know when they are. There are so many other idiosyncrasies, like sitting front to front. Well, forget that. They will not talk to you. If I have a chair, and he has a chair there, and I'll look at him and talk, and I'll tell me about yourself. There is no way they won't say anything. I do sidewise sitting or whatever they are comfortable. And then one-to-one, forget it. Sometimes I violate the HIPAA requirement because I get them as a group, and hopefully they will provide support and encouragement to each other. So anyway, that's just a vignette of the clinical side of a problem of therapy.
So going back to like breaking the stigma within one's own family, so do you have any tips on how one could start that conversation, and especially if their family holds views that?
I think it's easier for me now to even say my story because I'm in my 30s. My mom is very supportive of like my philanthropy, pageant, or whatever it is. She's very supportive. But doing so, it really, being involved in removing, the slogan is within our group, which is Mental Health Matters, Arizona Strong. It's remove the mask, break the stigma. So that is my way of opening up that conversation with my mom. I'm still trying to learn how to approach my brother, so to speak, because he's in a different generation. He grew up different. He spent most of his life in the Philippines and just moved here when he was 35, my age right now. So with my mom her moving here when I was 11, I'm like in the middle of them. You have the most traditional one, which is my brother, and then me moving here when I was 16 and having half of my life being as Asian American. I'm trying to close that gap of like having that conversation. Actually last night, because I was like, oh yeah, we have an open conversation with my mom and I didn't even know that before I moved here, she confesses that she did write a letter and was thinking about contemplating about suicide, and now that we're talking about it and learning as I go and really how to be a service to the people and how passionate I am because I'm one of those kids, it opens that door. So I don't know, every family have a different way of having that conversation. For me, that's why I'm passionate with Ending the Silence, because we're going to every school. We're gonna present to the staff, and we're gonna present to the parents. And we're gonna educate the parents, because the parents has to lead. In educating the children and the youth. So we always have that approach. My ways in approaching breaking the stigma within my family will be different in each family. It's just my way of like, it's kind of like not addressing directly of like, yeah, mom, I'm doing the speaking event. Let's talk about our background. So that's how I approach it. So, and I would, so to speak, like jump to different generations to like, so how did that feel? How did Dad feel about this? Or like how? So I would jump to it and not really more organized, because I don't want her to feel uncomfortable. Because I don't want her to shut down as well too, because she's just now at 62 speaking about and breaking her own stigma of her own depression, of her suicide attempt and stuff. So I'm glad that I'm in this point in my 30s where I recognize the difference now and more educated, so to speak.
Thank you for sharing that.
Welcome.
I'd like to bring the discussion back to one thing we were talking about earlier, which is how gender may intersect with this. Like Dr. Kempo said, Asian girls age 15 to 29 have the highest rate of suicide within any group. So what are some reasons that this may be the case? Dr. Yu, you may answer this.
Gender, race. Can I go back and add to that last sort of comment? I just wanted to again sort of say publicly like how much I also appreciate you sharing your story. And I think for me, sort of the message underneath sort of your passionate sort of and vulnerability in sharing that story is I think what me and panelists sort of share in terms of, again, how do we sort of address this in terms of the stigma is partly to educate it, to sort of normalize the experience, right? Physical health, mental health. I tell my students, I went to go see my therapist the other day, and and you know, I tell my students to go see a therapist. It's to normalize part of that, but I also particularly appreciate, particularly for like family and friends, and I think in the sort of the tenor which I got your story is this sort of having these issues less as a impairment, but agency, but rather an agency and a very sort of empowering thing to do, right? I think particularly understanding within our community the sort of the shame and the guilt at the individual community level that sort of is sort of profound, being able to sort of normalize that and provide an alternative framework where this is really agency, like for you to be able to go take care of your your mind and your body is equally as important as diet, exercise, and anything else. But within that context where it's so hard, it is agency and empowering to see people vocalize their past experiences and how they got treatment, as well as helping those who need it to see that seeing a therapist is not because you're weak and you need help, but rather it's a behavioral manifestation of your willingness to survive and live, and that's honorable and that's beautiful. You know what I mean? For me, I think my work tries to sort of come from that perspective in terms of seeing like even these sort of things about emotional inability. I mean, it depends on who, again, framework matters, right? For Americans, yes, you could say Asians are emotionally, able to talk about their feelings, but from an Asian, our parents' perspective, that's a very different set of cultural experiences and expectations that they grew up. They didn't need to have emotional expression because the philosophy around how we thought about feelings and thoughts were more sort of one rather than separate. I think that my time's up. But to your question in terms of gender and race, in terms of expressions, I think about it more in terms of there are different demands and expectations. I think so sort of superficially we sort of see gender differences in therapy, right, in terms of how they can, women are more likely to sort of allowed to express their thoughts and feelings more so than men. But in contrast, I think because of the broad Asian American community, both Asian American men and women have a difficult time sharing their feelings and thoughts because of these other sort of cultural values around emotional restraint and fatalism, right? You have to just accept the way that things are. There's a lot of other cultural terms within Asian Americans that accept that. And so there are some of those gender differences, but what I sort of look at, again, is probably sort of a historical perspective in terms of, again, how Asian American men and women have become and need to navigate around gendered racism that leads to Asian American men have to navigate the spaces of being asexual, impotent, less manly, in contrast to Asian American women who are hypersexualized, right? And so there's, again, a long history of benefiting white racism and whiteness in which historically, legally, sociopolitically, among others, that sort of reify these sort of contrasting sort of stereotypes around Asian American men and women that leads them to navigate different stressors, different pressures. I have a certain privilege as an Asian American man that my little girl someday will not have in terms of how her sort of sexuality and her physical appeal will sort of supersede her beauty and her intelligence and her ability to, walk around without having to be sort of sexualized. That's the sort of privilege that I have as an Asian American man. And I think when you understand sort of the history of the gendered racism that leads to these different experiences of Asian American men and women, then they take those experiences and obviously it leads to have a very different experience of why they go into therapy, how they talk about it, as well as sort of the relevant treatments for that.
Dr. Urbano, would you like to add anything to that?
So I, totally agree with what you said, Brandon. So in terms of the sexuality, Asian women, so much pressure. Nowadays in culture here in the United States, the white women is a beauty. So the Asian American women are really seeking out. I wish I have a bigger boob. I wish I have a bigger eyes, nose, and everything. And then that mentality itself is really difficult to keep up and difficult to increase their self-esteem. And I personally have some experience as an Asian woman. The white men, ask me for dating, and I say no. Oh, I thought you're Asian. You're Asian. You can come with me. So it's some stereotypical view that Asian is very passive, permissive, and obedience. And that pressure, that socially constructed daily life, is a lot of stigma that I have to be like this way. If I say no, I am an outcast, and I'm not allowed to say no. If I say no, and then I was immediately disvalued. Okay, you need to go. look, I was treated as not human being. So, those pressure, the Asian women, the double, minority Asian women and, Asian and Asian American, really suffer mental illness and self-esteem, body image, and more oftentimes, girls have, eating disorder because of it.
And just to share, I think it started when I was 25. I get a lot of anxiety towards my birthday. My mom would always say, I'm like, you're gonna be this age. I'm like, Mom, I have my driver's license, I know how old I am. It's the pressure of like getting married and having 5 kids already by the time of that age. And having to say that I'm the youngest and I'm the only girl in my family, there's that pressure. And so when I turn in my 30s, I think it's getting worse because it's like every time my birthday I get so much anxiety. I'm like, oh my God, 1 more year of me not being married. So there's a lot of pressure, and I remember having talks with my mom of like relationships and stuff like that, and my breakup would be like, well, did you cook for him? What did you do? Like, so like that pressure of like being that Asian woman, whatever that may be, you have to be, like what you said, you have to be submissive. There's so much to it. I remember I run into this guy because my friend thought it would be funny to have a blind date, and I gave into it. And this American guy just said, well, he said something and I went against it. And the whole conversation, well, that's just what I not stand for and stuff like that. And he said, well, this is not what I'm expecting for. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? I said, he goes like, you have your own opinions. Your opinion is so strong, and you're openly saying it. He said, yeah, because I have my own thoughts. I have to have my own, with my journey in life, I form my own thoughts and my beliefs and stuff like that. Well, that's not that. I specifically said I wanted to date an Asian, but you're not my kind of Asian. So I was the wrong Asian. So I was just like, I just said, well, I am mixed.
You're just
I'm Spanish, Chinese, and Filipino. You got the wrong Asian. I have my opinions. So.
Can I add one more thing to that? I really appreciate the story. So as I talk about the different trajectory of Asian American men and women in the hypersexuality and the asexuality, I think it's also important the conversations that we don't have in between those. Particularly, I think the purpose of why we have these separate stereotypes for Asian American men and women historically is not only because it is sexist and racist, but also it limits our conversation to those that may not necessarily identify with being either a man or a woman. So non-gender, binary, trans, that are part of the Asian American community that often go invisible in these sort of narratives and conversations. I just want to acknowledge their experience in this room. That's part of the conversation, but we probably rarely ever think about. So.
Thank you for bringing that up. Would anyone like to add to that about the experience of LGBTQ individuals who may also identify as Asian American? Okay, well, yeah.
It's not accepted.
Yeah.
Okay? I'm just stating what is true in the Asian community, especially the first generations before that. There's no way that you are not a man or a woman or a boy or a girl. And as you grow up, as Dr. Yu said, you don't know what to do from the prohibition, from your own self-awareness, and what is expected from your friends. So that's true whether it's trans women or trans men. That's a problem. It's just not accepted. Now, hopefully, after so many generations, that too will accomplish itself.
So my uncle, until the day he died, he never knew his only son was gay, but all all of the cousins knew about it. You know. But because of the culture, going back to the culture, it's unacceptable. You're the pride of the family. There's certain prides that you hold in Asian community. It goes back to the culture, what stereotypical, like you have to do this, you're gonna be this, and you will be this. So it's going back to having that constant mask that you have to wear to please your people, to please your community, to please your parents, to fit that mask, and it gets so tiring. It gets that's why I get so much anxiety, depression, and all that stuff, because you're constantly wearing a mask to please everybody else. So, and one of my brother told that guy, because he run into him and he was openly about it, and my brother was like, dude, it's okay, it's us. But he would, like clean up and like act like a straight guy. And we try to encourage, because we are saying like we're gonna break that stigma in our generation. We're gonna be accepting and we're gonna talk about it, but it's hard, because once you grow up from it and you are built to think that way, it's not being addressed. So it's we have to, with the play on social media and stuff like that, hopefully, and when we're talking about it and sharing a story and breaking the stigma and all that stuff, hopefully we can encourage those people to be, everything's gonna be okay. Like it's okay.
This is, double and, triple minorities. Asian American itself is already, considered minority. And on top of it, LGBTQ is another, invisible minority. So, as an Asian American, we have visible minority. People know that. I'm from different country. I have accent. And and people know that I'm from Asia because it looks like it. Yet, LGBT is invisible. If you don't, come up, no one knows it. So then, okay, so another, stigma do you want? It's a personal, it's a personal choice. Just don't do it. That's the, people around the individual, express.
So I'm gonna have to stop the discussion right there, as we're nearing the time for the audience Q&A session. But I would just like to thank each of you. I think we had a very productive discussion, and it was very interesting and informative.